The photograph was taken at exactly 3:40 p.m. on a gray, windless afternoon in February of 1889. There was no warning, no sense that anything was wrong. Not then. The camera had been mounted, its brass lens glinting faintly beneath the low Vermont sun, aimed squarely at two boys standing still in the dead grass near a sprawling sycamore tree. They didn't smile. No one did in portraits back then. But their eyes, James's slightly squinted, Ellery's wide and fixed, betrayed something else entirely. A tension, a stillness too sharp to be comfort. The older boy, James Corbin, aged 12, held one side of a tin pail. His hand was pale from the cold, the knuckles pressed hard against the metal handle. His younger brother, Ellery, aged 10, clutched the other. Their coats were clean, their boots dusted, their corduroy trousers pressed as if someone had spent the entire morning getting them ready. Behind them, the sycamore stretched its limbs upward like a figure reaching for the sky, branches thick, leafless, unmoving. Niels Halberd, the traveling photographer, ducked beneath the black cloth of his view camera, muttering to himself in German as he adjusted the lens. He was a quiet man, methodical, with thick hands stained from collodion and fixer baths. He didn't speak much English, but he gave the boys a thumbs up from behind the camera and then counted with fingers. 10, 9, 8. Neither boy moved. The exposure would take nearly 10 minutes, long enough for the sun to shift, but not long enough for memory to decay. As Halberd busied himself with the plate stack, loading the silvered glass sheet soaked in light-sensitive nitrate solution, the boys remained perfectly still. That was the rule. Any movement would blur the image, ruin the shot. But Halberd was good at this. He'd taken hundreds of portraits in towns just like Elmridge. People trusted him. They didn't ask questions. They just paid their coins and posed. At the edge of the field, a man stood watching. Dr. Horace Bellwright, the town's physician, leaned against a fence post, coat buttoned to the throat, eyes narrowed. He had come to the farm twice in the last week, at the mother's request. "James has been talking in his sleep," she had whispered to him. "He says the tree is whispering. Says the pail isn't empty even when it is. Bellwright had dismissed it as winter fever. Children imagined things, especially in the cold. Now he watched them pose in front of that tree, still as statues. The sycamore had been there since before the town was founded. Locals said its branches were strange, too symmetrical, too tall. Someone had once hung a scarecrow from it. Another claimed crows refused to land there. When the timer snapped, Halberd moved quickly, swapping the plate and sealing it inside its wool sleeve. "Sehr gut," he mumbled, nodding. "Good. Very good." He offered a nod to the boys, who said nothing. James looked over his shoulder once before stepping away. No one saw what the camera had captured. Not then. It wasn't until 60 years later, when the plate resurfaced during a routine archival scan in a Boston restoration lab, that something strange was noticed. At first it looked like shadows, smudges behind the boys, lost in the folds of tree bark. But when technician Raymond Cleves adjusted the contrast and applied a modern chromic acid enhancement, the shapes became clear. Two pale figures, suspended several feet above the ground, necks bent unnaturally to one side, rope lines faintly visible in the filtered light. The figures matched the boys. Perfectly. Their clothing, their height, even the slight lean in James's stance, it was all there, but captured again, farther back, behind them, hanging, lifeless. And yet the embossed date on the plate's edge, confirmed in every registry, etched into the silver, read February 9th, 1889. James and Ellery Corbin were not found dead until the morning of February 16th. The official record said both had been discovered by their mother in the barn loft, ropes around their necks, feet bare and pale from the cold. No signs of struggle, no note. The death was ruled self-inflicted, though both boys were buried before sunrise the following day, a decision the parish minister called hastened and heavy with sorrow. When Cleves showed the rescanned image to his supervisor, neither spoke for nearly a full minute. "Is it a double exposure?" his supervisor finally asked, voice tight. Cleves shook his head. "It's not smeared," he said. "Not layered. They're in the same focal depth, same exposure." He paused. "They're just there." An expert from the Candler Institute reviewed the plate, confirming that no known photographic process of 1889 could have produced such an effect. No trick of light, no chemical residue, no mirror illusion. "You're telling me," one reporter said years later, "that the camera captured the boys before they died, and also after?" The expert didn't reply, because he didn't know, and when the photo was shown to surviving residents of Elmridge, those who had known the Corbins, those who remembered the funeral, the hushed voices, the mothers wailing, not one of them denied the faces in the trees. It was them, James and Ellery, as they stood and as they hung. The question no one could answer, even after a century of analysis, was simple. The camera saw something the eye could not. The rope was rough and damp when Dr. Horace Bellwright touched it. He had found it hanging from the lower branch of the sycamore behind the Corbin farmhouse, the same tree that appeared in the photograph just days earlier. The morning frost had settled over the bark in a silver sheen, yet the fibers of the noose held a different kind of cold, one not born of temperature but of silence. Bellwright stood alone in the pale light of dawn, the hem of his coat brushing the stiff grass, his breath fogging before him. The farm was still. The barn door creaked gently in the wind, and the house, just 10 paces behind him, remained shut, its windows dark as if it had turned its face from the world. Inside, the bodies of James and Ellery Corbin lay beneath a coarse woolen blanket, placed not in their bedroom but on the parlor floor. The fireplace had not been lit. Their mother, Anne, sat in the far corner in a rocking chair that didn't move. Her hands were pressed together so tightly they had gone white. When Bellwright entered the room, she did not look up. She stared past him, at the wall, at nothing. "They were always afraid of the dark," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. "But last night they went into the woods alone." Bellwright crouched near the blanket. He was not a young man, and his knees cracked as he lowered himself. Gently, he pulled back the fabric. James, the younger one, had a smear of blood on his lip, likely bitten at the end. Ellery's fingers were curled tight, as if holding on to something invisible. Both had the same faint bruising around the neck, delicate yet decisive, the kind no child could replicate upon himself without hesitation. "How did you find them?" Bellwright asked, though his eyes stayed on the marks. "They knocked," Anne said, finally shifting her gaze. "I heard them knock at the back door, just before sunrise." The doctor turned, blinking. "Anne." "They were already gone by then." Her mouth trembled, but she didn't reply. Bellwright didn't press further. Instead, he stood slowly and turned to the ledger in his bag. He opened to the page for February 15th and wrote only one line. "Mother wept before I examined the rope." That evening, without ceremony or sermon, the boys were buried in the northern plot of the town cemetery. No family came to witness the burial except Anne, and she did not speak. The gravedigger, a broad-shouldered man named Curtis Went, swore that Anne insisted they be lowered before the sun had risen fully. "She said the light wouldn't know what to do with them," Went whispered later to Bellwright, like she thought they didn't belong in it anymore. 2 days earlier, on the 13th of February, the boys had been seen playing near the stream bed that cut through the farm's edge. According to local trader Malcolm Tyre, who often passed by in his wagon, they were chasing frogs with their boots off, despite the bitter cold. They seemed quiet. Not sad, not laughing. Just still, he told a neighbor, like they were doing what they'd been told, not what they wanted. The photograph had been taken on the 9th. The day had been overcast but dry, the kind of afternoon when the hills hung low under a slate sky. Niels Halberd, A traveling German cameraman with thinning blonde hair and an accent that set some in town on edge had been offering portraits for 3 cents, a luxury most families couldn't afford. But Ann Corbin had paid in exact coins, no haggling, and asked for the photo to be taken beneath the sycamore tree. "I want to remember them as they are now," she'd said, clutching her sons by the shoulders. Halberd had nodded, adjusting the brass lens and setting the exposure. The boys stood still, holding a tin pail between them. James blinked once. Halberd muttered in German but kept the shutter open. 10 full minutes. Then it was done. What Halberd did not know, what no one knew, was that just hours before, James had spoken of something he called echo dreams. He had muttered it to the house hand while buttering a slice of bread. "They keep calling us out there," he said, "but we don't know the words yet." Bellwright had made a note in passing that same week. James complains of sleep staggering and echo dreams. He chalked it up to childish imagination. Sleepwalking was not uncommon, and he'd seen it in boys suffering from grief or isolation. But this felt different. The Corbin boys had never lost anyone. No deaths in the family, no strange accidents, just long days on the farm, and a mother who grew more withdrawn by the season. After the burial, Halberd left Elmridge. No one saw him pack, and his wagon tracks vanished past the Lormer Pass by the 17th. His lodging at the town inn was cleared, the room left spotless save for a single cracked lens cap on the bedside table. The innkeeper, Mr. Durst, later claimed that Halberd had acted restless the night before, pacing and muttering under his breath. "He kept saying something about light seeing what we cannot," Durst recalled. Then he left. Some whispered that he had taken the Corbin photo with him, that it had scared him somehow. But Anne had retrieved it, wrapped in a piece of worn wool, from the dry goods store. The clerk, Ronald Emmett, remembered how her hands shook as she held the package. He asked if she needed help carrying it. "No," she said, pulling the bundle closer. "They'll be cold if I don't get them home." That spring, other townsfolk noticed a strange quiet around the Corbin land. The cows had stopped producing milk. Timber fell without effort, as if softened from within. Birds no longer nested in the sycamore's branches. And though no one spoke of it directly, some admitted to avoiding the road past the farm entirely. Once, Pastor Elias Harper, a soft-spoken man who disliked gossip, stood at his pulpit and closed a sermon early. "There is sorrow in the land," he said, eyes scanning the pews. "And strangeness," he added after a long pause, hung over the farm like unspent lightning. The photograph was taken at precisely 3:40 p.m. on February 9, 1889. Niels Halberd steadied the brass-lensed camera on its worn walnut tripod, the wooden legs creaking slightly as he adjusted for slope. Cold wind moved low across the field behind the Corbin farmhouse, rattling the naked limbs of the sycamore tree that stood center frame. James and Ellery Corbin, stiff in their corduroy jackets and boots caked with frost, stood obediently beneath it, a battered tin pail clutched between them like a relic. They did not smile. Children rarely did for portraits. A 10-minute exposure demanded stillness, not cheer. Halberd, breathing heavily from the weight of his equipment and the strain of travel, ducked beneath the black cloth. The light was failing fast, 29 degrees and dropping, but the western sky held just enough pale illumination to capture the silhouettes cleanly. He murmured something in German, adjusting the twin plate stack behind the lens. His gloved fingers, chapped and raw, clipped the collodion glass into place. A faint click, then silence. He counted slowly in his head. From the farmhouse porch, a figure stood watching. Ann Corbin, arms crossed tight around her shawl. Her face remained unreadable. She did not wave, did not speak, only nodded once when Halberd looked up. The boys remained motionless. Somewhere deeper in the woods, a crow called once, then went quiet. 10 minutes later, it was done. Halberd packed his chemicals, sealed the plates in tin sleeves, and made a brief note in his ledger. Elmridge, 2 boys, Westlight, Sycamore. Paid Anne approached and handed him 3 copper cents, her fingers trembling as she pressed them into his hand. She didn't say, "Thank you." She only stared at the camera, then at her sons, as if comparing the image she feared was now trapped inside. 4 days later, the boys would be dead. But no one knew that yet. Not the town, not Dr. Bellwright, not even Anne Corbin herself, or so the records insist. It wasn't until the spring thaw, in mid-March, that Halberd's plate arrived at the Elmridge dry goods store, shipped back from Montpelier. The store's proprietor, Mr. Lowell Graves, remembered Anne returning to collect it. He said she arrived just before closing, face pale, wearing the same shawl. She asked for the photograph by name, as if it were a living thing. She didn't unseal the cloth, Graves recalled decades later. Just wrapped it tighter in that wool and left. Crying, but not loud. For nearly 60 years, the image gathered dust in a sealed cedar box beneath Anne Corbin's old wardrobe until a military memorabilia collector stumbled across it during a house auction in 1947. The collector, Raymond Dorsey, had been scanning Civil War daguerreotypes for a regional archive when he set the Corbin plate into his light tray. What he saw made him step back. At first, he thought it was a damaged plate. 2 dark shapes hung behind the boys, elongated shadows, slightly blurred but upright. They weren't branches. They were too smooth, too vertical. Dorsey turned the glass sideways. The shapes remained, human-shaped, hanging. He made a note in pencil on the envelope. 2 shadows behind subjects, not tree limbs, shaped like hanging figures. But unsure if it was a fault in the emulsion or his own nerves, he passed the plate on to the Thorne County Archive, where a junior archivist named Edith Mallon took over. Edith was precise, methodical. When she pulled the Corbin plate from its wool wrapping, she noted that it was unusually warm to the touch despite the chilled room. She logged the temperature, examined the seal, and saw no signs of tampering. The ink on the back read clearly, A. Corbin, February 9th. She initiated a full reprocessing of the image, using a chromic acid contrast bath to enhance faint exposures. When the new print emerged, the details sharpened. Rope lines. Not just shadows now, but rope, faint but undeniable, descending from the upper branches of the sycamore tree. The figures were still there, still suspended. Around the neck of each silhouette, barely visible but unmistakable, were pale bruises in the shape of ligature marks. James and Ellery, but not as they had appeared during the shoot. Not standing, hanging. Edith stared at the developing tray for several minutes before calling in her supervisor. The lab assistant recorded her reaction as visibly shaken, eyes wide, refusing to speak for several minutes. When asked if it was a manipulated plate, she shook her head. "No part of the emulsion appears manipulated or retouched," she said finally, voice hoarse. She placed the glass down on the linen mat with care, as though afraid to damage it, or to wake something. "They are there," she said again, this time quieter. "They always were." The museum card was mislabeled. In 1951, tucked into a cedar drawer at the Vermont Historical Image Registry, a simple 3x5 archival card recorded the glass plate as Corbin Boys, undated. No mention of Elmridge. No mention of what was hidden in the shadows. No mention of the fact that the photograph had been taken 7 days before both boys were found dead. That mistake would go uncorrected for decades. It wasn't until 1968, during a quiet renovation of Brackenridge Infirmary's basement, that a misfiled coroner's note was found behind a drawer of handwritten prescriptions. It was yellowed and flaking, but still legible. Dated February 17, 1889. The handwriting belonged to Dr. James Harrell, a junior assistant at the time, who'd only stayed with the infirmary for 2 years before leaving town altogether. Post-mortem confirms bruising patterns consistent with hanging, the note read. Estimated time of death, 6 p.m., February 16th. It didn't match the official church record that placed the burial before dawn the same day. The document was passed quietly from hand to hand until it reached the desk of Dr. Leonard Glassmore, a somber man with thinning silver hair and a reputation for harsh skepticism. A professor of photochemistry at the Candler Institute, Glassmore had once discredited a decades-old photograph of a supposed ghost bride in England. He believed in lens, not legend. When he received the Corbin plate in 1972, he expected to dismiss it in under an hour. Instead, he spent 3 days in his lab, cross-referencing the exposure data with spectral tests and ultraviolet refractometry. On the morning of the 4th day, he summoned his assistant and said, without raising his eyes from the microscope, "You're going to want to sit down." Glassmore turned the plate slowly under the ultraviolet beam. Both the living boys in the foreground and the hanging silhouettes in the background emitted the same depth of light response. The emulsion chemistry was uniform. The silver nitrate layering showed no interruption, no retouching, no double exposure. "There's no chemical layering," he said, leaning back as if the air had thickened. "If it's a hoax, it was done before chemistry understood itself." The news traveled quietly through niche academic circles, historians, archivists, fringe researchers. Eventually, the plate came to the attention of Father Emil Radstock, a Jesuit scholar who specialized in religious iconography and anomalous symbology. He was visiting the Northeast on a lecture tour when he requested to see the original daguerreotype, now stored in a temperature-controlled drawer marked Pending Provenance. It was late October 1981. Outside, the trees were burning in autumn color. Radstock wore thick spectacles and carried a worn leather folder filled with notes on burial rites and sacramental markings. As he viewed the image through a sodium light visor, he grew still, adjusting the visor slightly, then lowering it. "Again," he said quietly. The technician cycled the light again. Radstock leaned in, just slightly, his breath fogging the surface of the plate despite the glass barrier. "There," he said, tapping gently on the bark of the sycamore tree behind the hanged figures. "That. Do you see it?" At first, the technician didn't, but under the sodium light, the fissures in the bark began to form a subtle, almost human-made shape, a distorted cross. The bottom line was slanted, the arms uneven. It wasn't part of the tree's natural growth. Radstock whispered, "A crooked cruciform." A gesture of failed burial. The technician glanced at him, puzzled. "What does that mean?" "In some folk traditions," Radstock replied, "when a body cannot be properly buried, when its soul is thought to be restless, symbols like these are marked near the place of death. It's an appeal, a ward, a desperate one." He folded his hands in front of him, resting them atop his folder. "But these boys were buried," the technician said. Radstock looked up, his face unreadable. "Were they?" From that moment, the photograph was no longer just a curiosity. It was a wound in time, a snapshot that didn't obey the rules of light, chemistry, or death. Scholars re-examined the record. Re-interviews were attempted with aging residents of Elmridge, but none remembered Halberd, the German photographer. None remembered the day the boys posed, and no one had an answer for why the figures, clear, pale, and silent, hovered inches above the ground with ropes drawn taut from the tree limbs above. Theories swirled, of course: hoax, error, psychic residue, but none accounted for the raw physicality of the figures, visible bruising at the neck, the placement of the hands, the shoes barely brushing the earth. These were not shadows. They were not echoes. They were there. And despite the clearest minds and strongest instruments, no second exposure, mirror trick, or chemical flaw had been shown to explain the hanging boys. They were photographed before they died, and also after. It began with the photograph laid flat beneath a sodium lamp, its glass surface trembling faintly beneath the weight of decades. The image, though fixed in time, seemed to shift under scrutiny, as if daring each man who studied it to see more than he wished to. Dr. Leonard Glassmore leaned in, the ultraviolet filter buzzing faintly at his shoulder. "These figures," he murmured, eyes narrowed behind thick lenses. "They're not overlays. There's no distortion, no warping, no evidence of tampering." He tapped the plate lightly, its chill seeping into his fingertips. "And yet, they're there." The lab assistant beside him, young, freckled, sweating, shifted uncomfortably. Could it be ghosting? Like chemical residue from a previous exposure? Glassmore exhaled. "Ghosting smears. This is sharp, clean outlines. You can count the creases in their collars." He paused. "That's not residue. That's presence." In the years that followed the plate's rediscovery, 3 camps formed, 3 explanations, each more unsettling than the last. They called them the schools of the Corbin photograph. The first, rooted in science, clung to the comfort of chemistry. Experts argued that Niels Halberd's equipment might have held trace silver salts from a previous plate, maybe an earlier exposure of 2 hanging dummies, reused unintentionally. Perhaps the emulsion layers hadn't fully cleared before the Corbin boys were posed. Perhaps. But every attempt at replication failed. Modern recreations using 19th-century wet collodion methods yielded only blurs, ghost streaks, and translucent messes. None produced crisp, fully formed images like the ones hanging in the shadows of the Corbin tree. "You'd have to believe Halberd invented a technique we still don't understand," said Dr. Emanuel Keene in a 1983 symposium, holding a replica plate up to the audience. "And if that's the case, why use it once, only once, on a pair of doomed children in a forgotten Vermont town?" The second theory was procedural and darker. It accused Anne Corbin herself, the boy's mother, of orchestrating a cruel deception. Some believed she had staged the photograph, paying Halberd to create a fraudulent plate that would later be used to fabricate a haunting. Perhaps she hoped to mask her crime in myth. Murder disguised as mystery. The idea caught fire in some circles, fueled by the whispers surrounding Anne's mental state and the unusual speed of the boy's burial. But that theory broke on the rocks of recorded detail. Dr. Bellwright's journal entries, plain, methodical, spoke of confusion, not cover-up. "Mother wept before I examined the rope," he'd written. "Not concealed, not avoided, just grieved." And the burial order from the parish? Signed and dated February 17th, too soon for any elaborate deception, especially in a town with 1 doctor, 1 priest, and eyes that never stopped watching. If Anne had murdered her sons and forged the photo as evidence of supernatural intervention, she left no trail, only grief and silence. The third school of thought chilled the mind. It was the paranormal theory, whispered by archivists and half dismissed by scholars. It suggested that the photograph was a time fold, a visual echo of an event yet to happen. Not a hoax, not a chemical fluke, but a moment trapped outside linear time, a camera that captured death before it occurred. Some even went further, claiming non-human influence, a spectral hand guiding Halberd's lens, making the invisible visible. This theory found unlikely support in records from Wales and Norway, where similar phenomena had been whispered about. Photographs where dead men appeared days before their demise, captured in windows, mirror panes, or the black eye of a lens. Cases unproven, ridiculed, but always present at the edges of record. "Look at the posture," said Professor Granger Hill of Halloway College during a radio interview in 1994. "The boys are stiff in the foreground, yes, but in the background, their necks hang, their feet dangle, and their faces, blurred but unmistakable, hold a stillness no living child can mimic." Still, the theory faced criticism. "Wishful patterning," argued skeptics. "People see what they want to see. Tragedy invites meaning, but meaning doesn't explain how Niels Halberd, the quiet German itinerant photographer, took one photograph and vanished. No census, no trade records, no obituary. Not in Vermont, not in New York, not anywhere after 1890. As if the act of taking that photo had erased him. In the archives of the Thorne County Folklore Archive, tucked inside a file marked Corbin Anomalies, a note was found, handwritten, undated. No signature, just a single line in pale ink. He photographed a moment that hadn't happened yet. At exactly 3:17 a.m. on March 3, 1892, a piercing whistle cut through the cold wind that blanketed Elmridge, Vermont. A moment later, flames burst through the roof of the Corbin farmhouse, painting the snow-covered fields in flickering orange. Neighbors, roused by the glow and the distant wail of a cow, arrived in scattered pairs, some in nightshirts, others with wet scarves pulled tight against their mouths. But by the time they reached the property, the fire had already consumed most of the wooden frame. The barn remained untouched, silent and dark, but the house itself was a roaring skeleton, glowing at the joints and hissing through broken windows. The men formed a line with buckets pulled hastily from wells, tossing water that turned to steam before it ever reached the flames. Among them was Thomas Marin, a timber hauler who had once delivered wood to the Corbins during the winter freeze. He shouted above the wind, "Where's Anne?" Has anyone seen Anne? But no one had. The last anyone remembered, she had been living alone since the deaths of her sons 3 years prior. Withdrawn and pale, she rarely came to town. Some whispered she'd gone half mad, keeping the boys' room untouched and reading aloud to their empty chairs at dusk. Now, as the house collapsed inward with a final groan, a single thought passed between the neighbors. She had been inside. Morning brought only soot and silence. The fire marshal, a reserved man named Everett Pike, stepped through the ruins with gloved hands and a kerosene lamp. He recorded the source as accidental, lantern-tipped during wind. Yet his assistants found no broken lamp glass among the debris. No charred remains were identified as Anne Corbin. Only a scorched Bible with a cracked leather cover and, nailed carefully to the barn wall, her shawl, faded blue wool, stiff with ash, still smelling faintly of lavender. Decades passed. The photograph, once thought lost, resurfaced in the summer of 1964. It was found during an estate auction in Duxbury, tucked into a cedar chest wrapped in thick wool and sealed in an envelope marked only with 2 words, handwritten in shaking script, "Do not reopen." The buyer, a retired archivist named Elliot Vaughn, was drawn to the lot because of its unusual labeling. It felt like a dare, he later said in a taped interview for the Elmridge Oral History Project, like something someone didn't want found, but also didn't want destroyed. Inside was the original daguerreotype plate. The inked name on the back, a Corbin, was still legible, though the edge had begun to fade. Vaughn turned it over gently, expecting another faded image of farmland or children in their Sunday best. What he saw instead chilled him. They weren't just standing there, he said, fingers trembling as he described it. There was something wrong. You could see the rope, the skin. You could almost hear the creaking of the branch. He donated the plate, anonymously at first, to the Thorne County Folklore Archive. The curators placed it in a protective display drawer, number 18, case 4, and left it there, unrestored. For decades, few touched it. Fewer still spoke of it. But strange things began to occur. One intern, a student named Carl Densley, reported that when he handled drawer 18, his hand tingled with warmth as if the glass had been sitting in sunlight. The storage room was windowless. Another, Martin Keene, swore he saw the faint sway of the tree's shadows move when he glanced at the plate under sodium light. He refused to return after closing hours. Though dismissed as tricks of the eye, the reports were quietly filed. Over time, visitors stopped requesting access to drawer 18. And always, one question lingered, dark and unanswered, curling at the edges of every whispered conversation. Why had Niels Halberd taken only one photograph in Elmridge, and why had he vanished after developing it? Who, or what, stood behind the lens that day? Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It draws on themes of mystery, death, and the thin line between reality and the supernatural in old photography. Its purpose is to raise awareness, provoke curiosity, and inspire reflection on the power of the unknown and the stories we see within the past.